In the morning when the birds rise up, their song becomes the world. My feet move down through the house, the day starts to unfurl. I get the coffee going and wake you with a smile, and we sit talking for a while.
So I've got this father who loved literature, and I saw him teach. I was in his class, and I loved the shape of literature right from the beginning. I loved the way he taught it, which was to kind of take it apart and look at it to see why it was beautiful.
And the water whirls its circus that goes round and round and round, and we stand grinning on the ground.
This is the second panel in a long poem called Cold War Remembrance Day 1983 that I wrote for my dad, Harry, who fought in the Second World War, and it's sort of about him. Number 2, he is one of those men who never talk about the war, not outright. All we knew was that he had been a sergeant. My mother had saved the 3 stripes and some medals he didn't care about. He had been a gunner. When I was 21, I drove up to Gerrard to drive him down for the weekend. We were just about the only thing moving on the highway that night, the headlights burrowing in endless charcoal, tunneling south. In that darkness, he did ramble on about the war for no apparent reason. He drove a truck, he said. One time when he'd stopped for a coffee and cigarettes somewhere in Belgium, his Jeep was blown up while he was inside the canteen. Funny stories about arriving back 3 days late from a weekend pass in Paris. A young woman he had gone out with near the training camp in South England. Suddenly he was talking about these things. They seemed to me then, for I was so young and confident, to be the surface of a dark volume in which my father lived. Just north of the turnoff to the Alaska Highway, I ran over an animal in the darkness. Don't worry about it, he said. Watch the road. Someone else asked me earlier this year, what about music and writing? It has a huge effect on the rhythm of writing. So when you write music, contemporary music, or you sing old songs, which my sister and I did, you really get into the lyrical quality and the rhythm of that. It's the nuances of the rhythm and the phrasing, right? So it's phrasing in music. And so how you will tackle even a cover song now, or if I write a song, how I'll tackle the phrasing of it. It's a timing thing, right? So it's both the sound of the words, but also, the way you drive the rhythm of the piece. Like Neil Fraser once, the guy I play with, pointed out that I always am singing behind the beat, right? So I'm waiting, right? And it's my way to get my voice into the structure of the piece, right? And I wonder, okay, does that carry over into poetry and into fiction? And yeah, it does, right? Like I am writing behind the beat, or writing against the structure, right? So there's something really complicated that is right at the bone of what you do when you sing and you write that is the same, right? For me, and that whole issue of the placement of the voice, it's like almost like if you could imagine like 2 beats happening, then the voice, right? So you get a line. I drive around the city like everybody else. I clean out the side compartments in the dark crevices and seams of the door of my car, where I crumple up chocolate bar wrappers and stuff them sometimes. On other days I could get organized enough to wash and vacuum the whole thing, creating a brand new world of car in an hour. And I walk on the cement sidewalks in my sandals,
and feel the heat of these sunny spring days through the leather and through my exposed toes. I walk past the enamel-painted frames of the windows leading to my favorite cafe and order the usual, lugging my takeout coffee onto the charcoal street, squinting into the afternoon sun, gripping the steering wheel with real hands, real flesh, drop by the bank, take some money out, pay some bills, put some money in, all the usual stuff, and drive up onto the shaded asphalt of my own driveway, turn the car off, breathe in the heavy tree-scented air, see the lush gardens she has made, feel the wood of the gate as it creaks open, reach down to look into the eyes of my loyal dog who loves me, sense myself anchored in all this, and walking through my back door into my home where everything sits where it's supposed to, heavily and solemnly as my life. I feel myself begin to thin out in the world, through the ceiling of my solid house, away from the heart's gravity and up over the gray shingled roof that covers and protects everything I love, and into these blue skies which aren't really blue when you're ascending, but hard to nail down, hard to describe, now substanceless in an ether you're examining so far away from my care. Throw me back, I gasp, throw me back. Unhook me from this eerie other element and heave me back down there where I can swim and love and turn into a dust that doesn't frighten me. Every time I see this town, I wonder where my time has gone. I see this kid on a Friday night, I see his face neath the thin street light.
Because this is our little Eden, so we've kind of slowly made this house a place where she can paint and I can write. Yeah, it's pretty good actually, and we do get along, sort of. Yeah, we do.
We do. Yeah, ask us, do we have, really important art discussions at home? Not really.
Not really. No. Someone asked me that just recently. I said,
really.
Sometimes I guess. But you know what we are a good example of? And they're wondering, who are these eccentric old shriveled up raisins? Well, you aren't a shriveled up raisin. You look fantastic.
Thank you, John.
But I'm speaking only for myself. But anyway, we were a couple who lived a life in art. And there's nothing like it.
We still are a couple, aren't we?
We still are. Okay. And we still live this life in art. It keeps you young, keeps you curious. Yeah, on your toes. It's always changing.
Actually, it's really great because when I'm painting and he's writing, that's when it's the best. So we can actually work in opposite ends of the house, and we both know that the other is working, so it's very easy. But
yeah.
He's rather self-absorbed, though. I, of course, am very, always willing to hear about his ideas.
Oh my God. Oh my God, the lies, the subterfuge. We've been thrown twice in our lives, 3 times actually, but twice. In a really lucky way, I ended up on these sabbaticals where we ended up staying in very small cramped quarters for a year, both times, both working. And I'm telling you, nothing tests a relationship better than that.
But actually, that worked out really well.
What's your name again? But the neat thing is that the writing was, lower on the priority list than the huge studio that you were, painting in. So
I did have the bigger room with the bigger table.
It was easy.
Yeah.
No, we survived it. It
was just him and the earth. Why then this fear, he wondered vaguely? as if a more objective part of himself could afford to stand back, amused, curious about the situation that was unfolding, while his real self became more frightened as the dark closed in. What was this fear, and why did it visit him like this? What was he afraid of? He didn't know. There was no answer he could see yet. He just wanted it to be over. Occasionally he'd hear a noise, a branch rustling, a twig being broken by something that also moved. And he'd walk faster, though he knew he'd have to be more careful, especially when he began to descend. In time, his legs became more unsure of themselves. It was difficult to keep the boots firm on the slopes. The mist had made the ground slippery in places, while in other spots, leaves had built up, and it was easy to slip if he wasn't cautious. His mind became focused on one thing, the lights in the kitchen at Glenderick. He had to get there. From the beginning, I think it was obvious to me that I might get accused of that kind of self-indulgent thing that people do get accused of. So I don't know how to answer that question except to say that I got really used to it and really admired it in the models that I saw, like in Joyce, especially in Dubliners and Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. It what would eventually become metafiction, which wasn't at the start, but that kind of willingness to see the self as a microcosm and work with it. Like Joyce is so funny in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. It's such a funny book about how we learn to become who we become, right? So I was always very comfortable in that genre, and so I got used to this, and so this is the first time I ever said it in this way to answer this question, but I think it had a lot to do with my dad's sense of humor, and his sense probably that life is worth telling, right? And that's where all your authority is. That's where your well of awareness is, right? I don't need to invent a bunch of characters in, Choctaw County, Mississippi to tell my story, right? Why not just draw on the 9 people I grew up with, and that's a pretty deep well. But a life worth telling, yeah, a life worth telling. When I kept getting models that reinforced that, whether it would be, let's say, the wonderful honesty of Margaret Lawrence in The Diviners, right? Where she's a writer writing her last novel, which in fact she was, right? About a writer who had created these other characters, right? And so there's where that interest in the autobiographical suddenly becomes, as it moves from a modern mode, let's say Joyce and Woolf and D.H. Lawrence and Henry Miller, that they're all doing what we're talking about, right? So what happens when that goes through that kind of arc into postmodernism, right? Well, suddenly, the writer writing about the grandmother who was, suddenly you get these layers that become like metafiction, and so those stories and So Won't Go Away that's the exuberant kind of fun they begin to have. We can understand it perfectly in music. We can't understand it in writing. It's one of those things, forest and the trees. Like in music, you understand that if you're a guitarist and you learn the fundamentals, and the only way you learn the fundamentals is by over and over, it's all repetition, and you just get all that notes and the range, the passing chords, everything, your knowledge of music, who you listen to. So you've got this archive in your head, right? And you work, and then eventually you've worked so hard that you step away from all that work and you begin to improvise. You know, you're not copying anymore. You're not doing a cover tune. You're not even echoing anybody, although all those things may be partly what's happening. But you've stepped away from everything you've learned and you're just unconsciously playing. In order to get to that magical point in music, you have to really work to get there, right? Same in dance. To be able to have that moment, right? And the same in writing. Is you try all these things and you try all these things. You try different points of view. You try different verb tenses. You try different, participles and gerunds and adjectives and adverbs, overwriting, underwriting, watching different models, right? It's all that stuff is gorgeous, right? Like you have to do that. And then suddenly, one morning, you're sitting there and you're not thinking about all that stuff. And you can't. You've got to let it go, right? And that's that real paradox of control and creation.
You're just going to have a wonderful time later, and we're going to end off with an old Bob Dylan tune we like to do.